Mist pooled along the hedgerows like a low-hung veil as the carriage rumbled toward the eastern counties, its wheels carving thin tracks across the frost-kissed road. England in the late Regency was a land suspended between elegance and unease, still glittering with aristocratic splendor, yet shadowed by the shifting economy the wars had left behind. Within this uncertain landscape moved Eleanor Harcourt, her gloved hands folded tightly over a modest traveling bag, her posture composed through sheer determination rather than comfort. She was scarcely 21, possessing the sort of beauty that did not command a room but lingered in memory. A soft intelligence in her gaze, a gentleness in the line of her mouth, and a quiet resilience that had been neither taught nor admired but forged through necessity. Only 2 years earlier, Eleanor had occupied a markedly different world. Born to the respectable Harcourt family, landed, though never wealthy, she had been raised among books, afternoon musicales, and the gentle hum of social expectation. Her father, Edward Harcourt, had been a sensible man until ambition crept into him like a slow fever. The promise of prosperity that accompanied wartime trade had dazzled him, and he ventured into shipping investments that seemed, at first, as sound as any opportunity presented to a gentleman of modest means. Eleanor remembered the early days of that venture, her father's confident stride, the excitement that crackled through their home whenever news arrived from London. For a brief period, the Harcourts nearly brushed the edge of comfort that flirted with nobility. But fortunes tied to global markets could unravel with merciless speed. When post-war volatility struck, Edward's ventures collapsed under debts he could neither anticipate nor settle. Creditors descended. Former friends grew mysteriously unavailable. Invitations that had always arrived without fail were suddenly lost in the post. The handsome Harcourt estate, once alive with music, the rustle of gowns, and Eleanor's laughter, fell into an echoing silence. Eleanor watched her father shrink into the silence, consumed by a shame so vast it dominated every corner of the house. Her mother had passed years before, leaving behind only a faint scent of lavender in an old shawl and the memory of warm hands smoothing Eleanor's hair. Without that gentle presence to steady them, father and daughter navigated ruin as though adrift on an unfamiliar sea. Eleanor, raised to be a gentlewoman, offered to take in sewing or provide piano lessons, but her father refused with a kind of brittle dignity. The world, however, cared nothing for his sentiment. With no dowry and no social standing left, Eleanor became a burden her father could neither lift nor justify. It was in the late autumn, when the final creditor had taken possession of the last parcel of land, that Edward sought the assistance of their distant relatives. Their replies, written in elegant script and steeped in polite refusal, cited the difficulties of their own households and the unfortunate impropriety of offering refuge to a young woman who could not contribute. The message beneath the gilded language was unmistakable. Eleanor was unacceptable, inconvenient, and unworthy of the expense. The bitterest blow came when her father, with the reluctance of a man burying hope itself, arranged a position for her as companion to the widowed Countess of Greymoor. Eleanor had never met the Countess, though she had heard whispers of her stern temperament. The arrangement offered food, lodging, and a kind of genteel servitude that kept Eleanor from the indignity of actual domestic labor. But it also announced, plainly and irrevocably, that she no longer belonged to the world of her birth. Her father insisted upon the arrangement, insisting it was the only path left to preserve her honor. Eleanor could not deny the logic, but the decision struck her like abandonment nonetheless. Now, in the quiet interior of the carriage that carried her toward her new life, she tried to reconcile the girl she had been with the woman necessity demanded she become. She allowed herself one glance at her father sitting opposite her. His face, once lively with color, had grown pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed by regret. He met her gaze only briefly, offering a small, strained smile before turning to the blurred landscape beyond the window. Eleanor felt a knot of tenderness and sorrow tighten in her chest. She wished she could take his hand, reassure him that she bore no resentment, but grief, particularly the kind that stains a family's name, rarely permitted such open gestures. The carriage slowed as the estate of Greymoor emerged from the morning mist. It was an imposing structure, a sweeping manor of grey stone softened only by the remnants of climbing ivy. The windows glimmered faintly with the promise of warmth, though the sight of such grandeur only intensified Eleanor's anxiety. She wondered how a woman like the Countess, accustomed to servants, luxury, and unyielding order, would receive the daughter of a gentleman disgraced by financial ruin. Inside the manor's entrance hall, Eleanor inhaled the faint scent of beeswax and aged wood. Servants moved briskly, ignoring her with a practiced indifference shown to those neither servant nor true gentlewoman. Her father exchanged brief words with the steward before turning to her. The farewell was painfully restrained. A quick embrace, a whispered apology, a promise he could not possibly fulfill, and then he was gone, the echo of his departing footsteps lingering long after the doors closed behind him. She was led through a corridor lined with portraits of Greymoor ancestors. Their painted eyes followed her with austere judgment, as if assessing her worthiness to tread upon their legacy. At last, she was ushered into a sitting-room where the Countess of Greymoor awaited. The Countess was tall, her figure thin yet commanding, draped in dark silk that accentuated the steel in her posture. Her face, framed by impeccably styled silver hair, carried the elegance of breeding and the severity of a woman long accustomed to authority. Yet her eyes, sharp as they were, held a flicker of curiosity as she regarded Eleanor. "So," the Countess said after a moment's quiet appraisal, "you are Miss Harcourt." Her voice was cultured, cool, and edged with a kind of polite distance Eleanor recognized immediately as habitual. "Yes, my lady," Eleanor replied, forcing steadiness into her words. "I am grateful for your hospitality." "Hospitality is not quite the term," the Countess corrected, though without unkindness. "You will serve as my companion, read to me in the afternoons, manage my correspondence, and accompany me when appropriate. In return, you will have lodging and a measure of stability." Eleanor inclined her head. "That is all I ask, my lady." The Countess observed her a beat longer. There was nothing sentimental in her gaze, yet something in Eleanor's composure seemed to satisfy her. "You will do," she said simply. Thus began Eleanor's new existence, one marked by routine, silence, and an ever-present awareness of her precarious position. She rose early to assist with letters, spent long afternoons reading aloud from novels or histories, and kept her thoughts folded neatly away like linens in a drawer. The Countess was neither cruel nor warm. She demanded competence and rewarded it with a rare nod of approval. In the evenings, Eleanor would wander the quiet corridors, absorbing the loneliness that pressed against the manor walls like an unspoken companion. The winter deepened, and with it came the announcement that the royal household would host a grand reception for foreign diplomats and nobility in the coming month. The Countess, who maintained deep ties to the highest circles of society, received her invitation promptly. To Eleanor's surprise, she was informed she would attend as well. "You will accompany me," the Countess said, as though discussing the weather. "I dislike navigating such gatherings alone. You will remain close and ensure I do not engage in tedious conversation with those who mistake age for indulgence." Eleanor felt a subtle tremor run through her. She had not imagined stepping foot into the glittering heart of London society again, not after being so thoroughly cast out of it. Yet the Countess's decree left little room for refusal. That evening, as Eleanor stood at her narrow window overlooking the snow-blanketed grounds, she sensed a shift stirring quietly around her, as if the air itself held its breath. She did not know what awaited her in the capital, nor how a single evening might alter the fragile equilibrium she had only just managed to grasp. But as the moonlight traced a pale path across the frosted fields, she understood one truth with aching clarity. Her life, no longer bound to the predictable rhythm of Greymoor, had begun to tilt toward an unforeseen horizon, one that would carry her far beyond the fate she believed sealed. Carriages converged upon London as though drawn by an unseen current, each one carrying nobles, diplomats, and social arbiters toward the palace whose lamps illuminated the winter night. Within this tide of elegance arrived the Duke of Ashcombe. James Everley descended from his carriage with the restrained dignity that had become his armor since assuming the title only months earlier. His posture conveyed certainty, yet a discreet tension followed him like a faint shadow. The weight of expectations pressed heavily upon his shoulders, obligations to Parliament, the Crown, and the legacy of his late father and brother. He had no luxury to entertain frivolous pursuits, least of all the idle flirtations that consumed the attention of so many eligible ladies within the capital. Tonight, however, demanded impeccable presence, for the reception promised to gather the influential and the opportunistic beneath one splendid roof. Inside, the palace ballroom glittered with chandeliers whose many candles cast a brilliant glow across mirrored walls and silk-draped archways. The scent of beeswax, perfume, and evergreen garlands mingled in the air, forming an atmosphere both festive and ceremonial. As the Duke entered, conversations quieted momentarily, acknowledging the arrival of a man whose lineage and responsibility shaped English politics. James offered polite nods, exchanging measured greetings, though inwardly he felt the familiar fatigue of navigating a realm fueled by calculated alliances. He moved through the crowd with deliberate composure, pausing only when required, listening to compliments and veiled inquiries about his future marriage prospects. Elsewhere in the room, Eleanor Harcourt stepped cautiously into the shimmering expanse beside the Countess of Greymoor. She felt the weight of countless eyes glide across her before slipping past without lingering. Her gown, modestly mended and a season behind current fashion, contrasted with the brilliant fabrics adorning the women surrounding her. Yet Eleanor held her chin steady, reminding herself that she was here only to serve the Countess. Her purpose was simple: to offer quiet assistance, shield the lady from tiresome conversation, and remain unnoticed. The Countess herself moved with regal precision, offering curt acknowledgments to acquaintances while maintaining an expression that discouraged unnecessary familiarity. Despite Eleanor's efforts to remain inconspicuous, she could not ignore the awe the palace inspired within her. The vaulted ceilings, gilded columns, and polished marble floors embodied a world she once glimpsed only from the periphery. Memories of past gatherings, where she had stood among guests rather than behind them, flickered painfully before she banished them. She focused instead on the Countess's every movement, determined to avoid missteps. Even so, her attention drifted at intervals toward the grand cluster of diplomats conversing near the center of the room. Their attire differed subtly from English fashion, marked by unique embroidery and cultural insignia. She found their presence intriguing, though she dared not move closer. A sudden surge of guests separated Eleanor from the Countess, who continued forward without noticing the gap widening between them. Eleanor tensed, attempting to weave through the shifting crowd, yet every turn seemed to place another obstacle in her path. She paused near a column, searching for an opportunity to slip toward the Countess without drawing attention. In that moment of uncertainty, a foreign dignitary's aide glanced at her and offered a brief respectful nod, mistaking her poised stillness for deliberate diplomacy. Eleanor blinked, startled, but before she could correct the misinterpretation, the aide gestured subtly toward the approaching Duke of Ashcombe. James, unaware of the growing confusion, had been circulating toward the diplomatic assembly to exchange formal greetings. Observing the aide's signal, he assumed the young woman standing beside the column must be connected to the visiting delegation. Her posture conveyed quiet confidence rather than nervous deference, and her attentive gaze suggested intelligence. It was not unusual for diplomats to bring wards or protégés to such receptions, though they rarely integrated seamlessly into English society. James approached with professional courtesy, prepared to deliver the greeting expected of his position. Eleanor, realizing too late the implication of the aide's gesture, felt a sharp spike of panic as the Duke halted before her. His presence was formidable yet not intimidating, marked by an authority that stemmed from responsibility rather than ego. She attempted to speak, but her words failed to form swiftly enough. James, interpreting her silence as diplomatic modesty, bowed his head with measured respect. "Miss," he said, his tone both cordial and formal, "I extend to you the warmest welcome on behalf of our hosts. I trust your journey to England has been agreeable." Eleanor stared, momentarily bewildered. The room around them continued in gentle motion, yet a small circle of observers lingered nearby, witnessing the exchange with interest. She could not correct him now without creating the appearance of rudeness. Her throat tightened as she forced a courteous response. "You are most generous, Your Grace." James offered a faint smile, noting the clarity in her voice and the sincerity in her expression. He continued, "If there is any accommodation you require during your stay, you may instruct one of my attendants. England hopes to extend every courtesy to those who honor us with their presence." Eleanor inclined her head, careful to maintain composure even as confusion pulsed beneath her calm exterior. She recognized the danger unfolding, though she could not yet perceive its full magnitude. The Duke's words had granted her a position she did not possess, and the surrounding guests, ever hungry for novelty, had seized upon the exchange with swift fascination. Within moments, murmurs drifted through the crowd, weaving a narrative far beyond her control. The Countess, having finally noticed Eleanor's absence, reappeared at her side with an expression of controlled irritation. Yet when she observed the Duke's lingering regard and registered the whispers circulating around them, her demeanor shifted. With uncanny speed, Calculation softened her disapproval. She offered the Duke a graceful curtsy. "Your Grace, I trust my companion has not detained you." "Not in the least," James replied. "It was my pleasure to make her acquaintance." The Countess cast a discreet look at Eleanor, understanding immediately that correction would humiliate not only the girl but herself. Instead, she offered an approving nod, silently instructing Eleanor to proceed with cautious dignity. Eleanor obeyed, though her heart pounded with the realization that she now stood entangled in a misapprehension she had no power to untangle. James, noticing a subtle uncertainty flicker across Eleanor's expression, hesitated as though considering further inquiry. Yet duty called him toward the diplomats awaiting his attention. He offered a final respectful bow before withdrawing, leaving Eleanor suspended in a state of precarious grace. She watched him depart, feeling both relief and dread settle within her. When the Countess ushered her away from the crowd, her voice lowered to an urgent whisper. "Say nothing foolish," she warned. "The Duke's error elevates you more than truth ever could. Allow it to stand for now." Eleanor attempted to protest, but the Countess silenced her with a firm look. "We shall speak later." Eleanor followed obediently, her steps measured and her mind swirling. She had entered the palace as a shadow and somehow emerged as a figure of sudden interest, born of misunderstanding. Though she longed to return to obscurity, she sensed the choice had slipped from her grasp. The night pressed onward, gilded and treacherous, and with every passing moment, Eleanor felt the delicate balance of her life shift irreversibly toward an uncertain horizon. In the weeks following the palace reception, Eleanor Harcourt found her life altered with startling swiftness. Invitations began arriving at Greymoor not addressed to the Countess, as had been the pattern for years, but addressed to both ladies, with Eleanor's name written in graceful ink that betrayed genuine interest. The Countess accepted these invitations with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had long awaited the world's acknowledgment of her influence. Eleanor, however, received each envelope with a flutter of apprehension. She recognized that these elegant gestures stemmed not from admiration but from curiosity about the mysterious young woman whom the Duke of Ashcombe had greeted with disarming courtesy. The Countess wasted no time instructing Eleanor on the precise behavior expected of her. "You must remember," she declared one morning as Eleanor adjusted the folds of her gown, "that perception is everything. If others believe you hold value, then you must behave in a manner that does not expose the truth. Charm, modesty, and restraint will suffice. Speak little unless addressed. Listen always." Eleanor nodded, though inside she recoiled from the deception tightening around her like a drawn corset. Their presence was requested at a soirée hosted by the Marquis of Havering, an event known for its particularly discerning guest list. Upon arrival, Eleanor stepped into a room warm with candlelight and threaded with soft music. The array of richly dressed guests gave an impression of effortless luxury. Yet beneath their calm exteriors lurked a hunger for information, and tonight's subject of interest, however unwilling, was Eleanor herself. At first, conversations seemed harmless enough. Ladies complimented her on her composure, while several gentlemen bowed with courteous curiosity. But Eleanor sensed the unspoken questions beneath every smile. Her answers remained sparse, guided by the Countess's warnings, though each passing moment deepened her fear of contradiction. She longed to retreat to a quiet corner and gather her thoughts, yet social obligations propelled her forward like an oarless boat swept by a current. It was during one such exchange that she noticed the Duke of Ashcombe entering the room. His presence, calm despite the persistent attention he received, commanded the space without effort. Conversation softened as he passed, acknowledging the nobles with stately regard while deftly bypassing attempts to corner him into discussions of marriage alliances. Eleanor felt her breath catch, though she could not explain why. Perhaps it was because he represented the fulcrum upon which her false elevation balanced. Or perhaps there was something in the Duke himself, his steadiness, his unassuming gravity, that stirred within her an emotion she dared not name. James, for his part, noticed Eleanor almost immediately. He had not forgotten the sincerity in her voice or the gentle composure with which she accepted his unintended mistake. Since that night, whispers about the young woman with alleged diplomatic ties had drifted through the circles he frequented. Each whisper carried a different story, and none aligned neatly. He had begun to suspect that her origins were more complicated, yet he refrained from prying. He had neither right nor reason to question her before ascertaining whether she wished to confide. Tonight, however, her presence amidst the most discerning nobles of London intrigued him anew. He approached her with deliberate calm, careful not to provoke undue attention. Eleanor curtsied with controlled grace, though he observed the faint tension at the corners of her eyes. "Miss Harcourt," he said softly, "it seems fortune has allowed our paths to cross again." "Indeed, your grace," she replied, her tone polite yet tinged with caution. "London holds many gatherings." "True enough," he agreed. "But only a few host guests whose presence alters the conversation of every room." Eleanor's heart gave a small jolt. The compliment, though courteous, only reminded her of the precariousness of her position. She lowered her gaze briefly before meeting his eyes again. "I fear the attention is misplaced." The Duke caught the subtle truth within her words. "Perhaps," he said, "though attention is a difficult tide to command once it turns." Before Eleanor could respond, a cluster of ladies approached with exaggerated delight, eager to ingratiate themselves with the Duke while examining Eleanor through veiled scrutiny. James excused himself with diplomatic finesse, leaving Eleanor exposed to the swirl of pointed inquiries disguised as friendly interest. One of the ladies, Lady Selwyn, leaned closer with a saccharine smile. "Miss Harcourt, your accent is delightfully refined. Is it common where you were raised?" The seemingly simple question carried the barbed implication that Eleanor's background remained dubious. Eleanor offered a practiced smile, answering with careful neutrality. "My upbringing was devoted more to education than to travel, my lady." Lady Selwyn's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before she laughed lightly. "Ah, mystery suits you, I think." The encounter left Eleanor unsettled, and she excused herself under the guise of attending to the Countess. She found the older woman deep in discussion with two peers, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met, the Countess signaled a brief nod, silently urging Eleanor to maintain composure. Eleanor obeyed, yet the sensation of growing scrutiny weighed heavily upon her. Later that night, as the soirée concluded and guests spilled into the cool darkness, Eleanor attempted to breathe the fresh air as though it might cleanse her of the evening's tension. The Duke, standing near the entrance while awaiting his carriage, noticed her quiet struggle and approached once more. "You handled yourself admirably," he said. "These gatherings can be unforgiving." Eleanor hesitated before replying. "It is not the gatherings themselves that trouble me, your grace, but the expectations that accompany them." He studied her with thoughtful intensity, sensing the fragility beneath her composed demeanor. "If those expectations are burdensome," he said gently, "you need not bear them alone." The offer, though simple, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. Yet she could not accept help without risking exposure of the truth that bound her existence. "Your kindness is appreciated," she murmured, "but I would not trouble you with concerns that are rightfully mine." James seemed poised to say more, but the Countess approached, her tone brisk as she announced their readiness to depart. Eleanor offered the Duke a polite farewell before stepping into the waiting carriage. As the horses pulled away, she gazed at the passing lamps, wondering whether her refusal had protected her dignity or merely deepened her isolation. In the days that followed, scrutiny intensified. Rumors sprouted in the drawing-rooms and breakfast parlors, each more inventive than the last. Some believed she was the daughter of a minor diplomat. Others speculated she was a foreign heiress brought to England for political reasons. Eleanor attempted to maintain her composure, though she felt the delicate threads holding her fabricated position begin to fray. The most concerning of her inquisitors was the Marchioness of Hawthorne, a woman whose sharp intellect and sharper tongue made her feared even among the aristocracy. Eleanor first encountered her at a dinner hosted by the Earl of Rutherford. The Marchioness's gaze lingered upon her with an intensity that bordered on predatory interest. When their paths crossed near a marble hearth, the Marchioness spoke in a tone silken with malice. "My dear, you carry yourself beautifully for someone so recently introduced into our circles. One wonders where you acquired such poise." Eleanor's pulse quickened, though she managed a measured response. "I was fortunate in my upbringing, my lady." "Were you?" the Marchioness murmured, her eyes gleaming. "Fortune can be such a fickle friend." The ominous remark lingered long after the Marchioness drifted away, leaving Eleanor with the chilling certainty that her deception, unintentional though it was, had drawn the attention of someone who would stop at nothing to unveil it. That night, as she returned to Greymoor with the Countess, Eleanor felt the weight of an unseen shift. The deception that once offered refuge had begun to tighten like a snare. Yet even as fear coiled within her, another sensation stirred, an undeniable connection to the Duke, whose subtle interest hinted at possibilities she scarcely dared imagine. The path ahead promised neither safety nor clarity, but it beckoned nonetheless, urging her toward a fate she could no longer avoid. The morning after Eleanor's disappearance from Ashcombe House arrived with a sort of sallow, anemic light that seemed to leach the world of its warmth. The Duke awoke before his valet arrived, his sleep having been sparse, troubled, and fractured by images of Eleanor's pale face in the lamplight, her expression torn between longing and the sense of doom she carried like a mantle. He sat at the edge of his bed, buried his hands in his hair, and wondered how she could believe she must flee for his sake when every instinct within him rebelled against her absence. The house felt hollow without her, as though every corridor had been stripped of oxygen, leaving behind only echoes of her soft voice and the faint fragrance of lavender that had become inseparably hers. He knew he ought to attend to his morning correspondence, to the ledger entries requiring his signature, to the solicitor's pressing request for an audience. But duty, so often his compass, had finally lost the power to steer him. For the first time in his well-governed life, he threw aside appointment and protocol, summoned his horse, and set out to recover what he feared had slipped irretrievably from his grasp. Eleanor, meanwhile, rode in a plain hired carriage along the narrow country road that led northward out of London, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had slept little, and when she did drift into uneasy dozing, she started awake with the disorientation of a woman who had torn herself from the very axis around which her life had begun to turn. The decision to leave had not been a single moment but a slow accretion of fears, whispers she overheard in the drawing-rooms of those who now doubted her origins, veiled inquiries from ladies who wished to know how a supposed diplomat's ward carried herself with the manner of an educated English gentlewoman, and, most unbearable of all, the dangerous tenderness she felt in the Duke's presence. She believed she had crossed a threshold from which she must retreat before he sacrificed something irreplaceable for her sake. His reputation, his standing at court, his carefully cultivated alliances. And so she fled, praying that distance might dull the pain that sliced through her with every mile. But fate, which had already entwined their paths with peculiar determination, was not finished weaving its design. As the Duke neared the North Road, he found the tracks of a carriage matching the description of the one hastily hired from the mews near Covent Garden. He pressed onward, every thud of the horse's hooves striking the frozen earth echoing the urgency within him. The wind bit at his face, the cold stung his eyes, yet he urged his mount faster, driven not by desperation alone but by the clarity that had arrived only in the wake of losing her. He had spent years mastering the machinations of politics, managing estates, and navigating the expectations of aristocratic Britain, yet none of those accomplishments felt equal to this simple truth. He loved her, and no external force, no tradition or social decree, could alter that. Several miles ahead, Eleanor's carriage slowed as the driver announced that the horse needed water. They stopped at a small coaching inn, humble, quiet, and smelling faintly of peat smoke. Eleanor stepped down, wrapping her thin cloak more closely around her. The inn yard was almost empty, the only occupants a stable boy tending to a restless mare and an elderly couple preparing to depart. She wandered a few paces away, gazing toward the frost-rimmed fields where winter wheat struggled toward the muted sun. The scene was tranquil, yet inside her chest a tempest raged. She had imagined that by leaving she might reclaim some portion of her former self, the Eleanor Harcourt who once believed she understood her place in the world. Instead, she felt unmoored, suspended between the life she had abandoned and the life she could never truly claim. The Duke arrived scarcely 10 minutes later, breathless and disheveled, a sight entirely at odds with his usual immaculate composure. When he caught sight of Eleanor across the yard, standing alone with the wind teasing loose strands of hair across her face, something inside him seemed to break and mend in the same instant. He dismounted before the horse had fully halted, letting the reins fall where they may, and strode toward her with a purpose that silenced even the stable boy's idle chatter. Eleanor turned at the sound of approaching footsteps, and when she saw him, her breath caught as though seized by an invisible hand. For a heartbeat she wondered if she were dreaming, if the exhaustion of travel had conjured a phantom to torment her. But then he spoke her name, softly, urgently, and reality settled with the weight of undeniable truth. "Eleanor," he said, stopping mere paces from her, Why did you leave me no word? No explanation beyond vanishing into the night like a fugitive? She swallowed, unable to meet his gaze. Because I believed it was the only way to spare you further scandal. You must see by now that the truth of my origin cannot remain hidden. Your world is not one I belong to, nor one I should endanger by remaining within. If you think, he replied, stepping closer, that my world holds any meaning without you, then you understand me far less than I had hoped. His voice trembled with a rare vulnerability, a fissure in his aristocratic armor. I have spent years striving to meet expectations, to be the Duke my father raised me to be, the Duke society demands. But none of those obligations outweigh what I feel for you. The chill wind carried his words with startling clarity. Eleanor's heart wrenched as she forced herself to speak. Affection cannot erase the consequences that will follow. You risk your position, your alliances. The Queen herself may call your judgment into question. Then let her, he said simply. Let them all question me. I am weary of shaping my life according to others' dictates. For once, I would choose my own path, even if it leads through fire. He reached for her hand, not in a dramatic gesture but with the reverence of a man touching something precious. Eleanor, you were never merely a ward, nor a servant masquerading in borrowed finery. You are a woman of integrity, intelligence, and courage. A woman I cannot, will not, allow to vanish from my life. Her eyes brimmed with tears she fought to contain. You speak as though love alone can defy the rigid order of England. But I fear it will crush us both. Then let it attempt to, he murmured. Let society try its worst. I have faced Parliament, diplomats, adversaries with twice my experience, and none have unsettled me as much as the thought of losing you. Silence stretched between them, shaped not by uncertainty but by the dawning recognition that the course of both their lives hinged on this fragile moment. Eleanor felt a shift within her, a loosening of the fear that had driven her onto the North Road like a hunted creature. She had fled believing she protected him, yet now she saw that her absence wounded him more deeply than any whisper of scandal could. At last, with a breath that felt like surrender and liberation in equal measure, she said, If I return with you, I do so not as an obligation nor as a figure to be shielded behind falsehoods. I return only if you promise that whatever future awaits us, we face it honestly. He bowed his head slightly, not as a nobleman offering courtesy but as a man making a solemn vow. Honestly, and together. That I swear. Their clasped hands remained suspended between them, a quiet tether binding their futures in ways neither had foreseen months earlier when their lives first collided by accident and deception. The inn-yard seemed suddenly transformed, no longer a place of departure but of recommencement. The Duke guided her toward his horse, calling for her driver to be compensated and released, and though the path ahead promised scrutiny and challenge, neither felt the weight of dread. Instead, an unspoken understanding passed between them, the sense of two souls who, having been shaped by circumstance and constrained by the era's unforgiving strictures, would now walk forward with the courage to defy them. As they rode back toward London, the winter sun broke more decisively through the clouds, spilling pale gold across the road as though blessing the choice they had made. Eleanor leaned into the rhythm of the horse's movement, her fears gradually loosening their grip as she allowed herself to imagine a life not ruled by hiding but by hope. The Duke kept one gloved hand over hers, steady and resolute, as if anchoring her to the world she had feared to claim. For the first time since their fateful meeting, the future no longer felt like a precipice but a horizon, vast, uncertain, and shimmering with possibility. And though England might raise its brows and wag its disapproving tongues, neither Eleanor nor the Duke felt the old dread of society's censure. They had chosen each other, fully and fearlessly, and in an age governed by restraint and appearance, such a choice was nothing short of revolutionary. Their journey continued beneath the widening light, two figures on a winter road, bound not by accident or pretense but by the profound and quietly triumphant certainty that love, when met with courage, could reshape even the most unyielding world.